Right, next up is omnipotence. Now, omnipotence is looked at just with the eternity idea as its first issue with whether they're compatible or not. And many people say that effectively you cannot both be omnipotent and omniscient. So we've got the Hezekiah example. It makes no sense whatsoever that God can change his mind. If he is omniscient, then he would have been aware of what he was going to do. He would be aware of the decision that he'd made. So therefore, God cannot change his mind, limiting his power. As well as that, there's all the classical problems of the paradoxes. Can God create a stone which he cannot lift? If he can, then there's something he can't do, he's not omnipotent. If he can't, then there's something he can't do, he's not omnipotent. This is something which Dawkins has famously put in some of your notes, where he effectively says that you can't have those two ideas for the two reasons. Now we've got two different types of omnipotence. We've got Descartes' idea and we've got Aquinas' idea. Now Descartes' idea is that omnipotence means that God can do the illogical. Not just the logically possible, but the illogical. That omnipotence means being able to do absolutely anything. So therefore, God can create a stone which he cannot lift. He can make 2 + 2 = 5, and there'd be no logical contradiction. Now let's get back to the stone. There's no contradiction because God can do anything, including illogical contradictions. And we require this type of God, according to Descartes, for his ontological argument, if he's truly going to be perfect or the greatest. So there are no problems with paradoxes. One of the main problems with Descartes, though, comes with the problem of evil. If God can create the illogical, then there would be nothing illogical with the inconsistent triad. God could create a world where we have free will, but also we are compelled to do good. We have to do good, but we've still got free will, because there's no contradiction. So therefore all the theodicies will ultimately fail, because God could create the perfect world, and therefore he's not, and therefore, we can't justify it. Maybe he is still omnibenevolent, maybe he's still omnipotent, because he can do away with the contradictions, but certainly not worthy of worship. Now Aquinas is less problematic, and what he says is that omnipotence means that God can do anything that is possible, not anything that is impossible. And what he says is the idea of Descartes' definition, obviously Aquinas comes before Descartes, but he would say this, is a matter of what you call empty concern. Illogical words is all it is. It's nonsense. It makes no sense to say that God can make 2 + 2 = 5. And what he says is that simply God can do the possible things. He is the all-powerful being. Now a version of this is put forward by Vardy. Now what Vardy says is that rather than talk about omnipotence, we should talk about almighty. And he says ultimately there are things that God can't do. So he goes even further than Aquinas. Not just that God can do everything possible, but there are some things which are possible that God cannot do, not simply illogical contradictions. An example of this is with the creative act. Almighty means that God is the most powerful in the world, but not that he can do absolutely anything. He's created a world, particularly when it comes to free will. God cannot, according to Vardy, mess with our free will. He can't force us to accept it. There are limits to it, because of the world in which he's created. The world is reliant upon him, but he can't possibly intervene in certain circumstances, because if he did, then it would be impacting our free will. So yes, of course, God cannot do all things. Now, there's also issues with religious language as well, about how we're going to express this. But if any question on omnipotence, you'd be talking about the other theories as well in a bit more detail.